Just about every week of Donald Trump's presidency, there has been at least one tweet or statement or action that in any other era would be a defining moment for the White House. But in our new chaotic, frenzied, all bets are off American culture, nearly all of those stunners have been forgotten. So while it is tempting to declare Charlottesville as President Trump's, this time is for real, defining moment, it's also good to remember that there's always tomorrow. Still, surely this time it's different, right? Well, as it happens, the team here at the Marist Poll was polling before Charlottesville and has been polling afterwards. So we've actually got answers. This time on Poll Hub, Charlottesville and Trump's crumbling base. Let's get started. Hi, everybody. It's Poll Hub. I'm J.D. Dapper.
And I'm Lee Marigoff, director of the Marist College Institute for Public Opinion. Joining us also is
Barbara Carvalho, director of the Marist Poll.
What a week. When you turn on the news channels, and from Fox to CNN to MSNBC, and then the networks, and pretty much every professional journalist on all of those networks is staring slack-eyed into the camera going, what just happened? And this was after the news conference in Trump Tower, talking about Charlottesville with Donald Trump. You do kind of get to the point where you're saying, is this different than all of these other times with Donald Trump? But you guys have been in the field here. You've been polling before and after Charlottesville around all these reactions. I got to tell you, I'm going to give away the punchline here. Not that much has changed.
First of all, as a pollster, but also I'd like to think as a human being, because those are not necessarily totally separate, I would say that I always, in an event like this, I mean, I was moved by what I was seeing on TV and the young lady and the police folks who died. I mean, I'm trying in my mind to also think not only when we poll there are people behind these numbers, you know, that's who we're really talking to, but also there are people who've been dramatically affected by this. So in some ways, the change is that, yeah, there's some funerals going on that for people who, you know, otherwise didn't deserve that. And so that, I mean, I would sort of make that as a preface to this. Now, poll-wise, we've seen a cataclysmic series of events, not because Donald Trump's approval rating changed. He was low before. He's low now. The numbers are still at 35%. His base, which we will talk about, crumbling somewhat, which is an interesting observation in terms of poll numbers. But I guess the bottom line in these polls is that the majority of Americans think his reaction was not strong enough, and just about 1 in 4 disagree and think he was on target with his comments.
Well, yeah, Lee, you make a good point that I think not only are there people behind the numbers, but I think just as a nation, everyone was stunned by the events of Charlottesville, but troubled by the president's reaction. And I think when you say that a majority of people don't really understand or agree with how the president dealt with the issue, you also need to look at the fact that another 1 in 5, 21%, couldn't even characterize it for us. In other words, they were unsure even how to weigh in on what the president did and said.
So let's look at the numbers in this poll and unpack some of that. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the reaction to this from the people that you talked to.
Well, I thought one thing we saw, which I thought was very, very unusual and interesting, was how people of different races respond.
Oh, yeah. Usually, and that's all we talk about, is how polarized we are as a nation, how polarized we are politically, how polarized we are, across, racial lines. That's a really good point that Lee is making. What we see is actually more of a consensus on this issue, particularly with regard to the president. 77% of African Americans and 55% of Latinos those believed Trump's response, really was inadequate. And, when we think about the fact that, there's been a lot of racial issues between people of color and the president, that makes sense. But then we also look at white Americans, and a plurality, 46% of white Americans also said the same thing. And a notable proportion of them were also unsure about what to even say about the president.
And only 31% of white Americans felt that President Trump demonstrated enough leadership, that he was forceful enough on this. And I was looking at these numbers and the poll we did over the previous weekend and the one we just finished, and we're very polarized. But I think, as Barb did indicate, ironically, there's a little more unity because the groups that Donald Trump was talking about are such fringe groups.
Yeah, talk about some of these numbers. I think some won't surprise people. So the number of people who support the KKK, not surprisingly, very small. It's like, do you support Nazis? I don't think you're going to get many people saying yes.
Well, but we actually didn't ask it that way. We asked it whether you mostly agree or mostly disagree with the beliefs of each of these groups. And you also people were also able to say, well, I don't have an opinion either way, or they could say, I don't really know enough about that group to even have an opinion. So we were trying to get a sense of what people think about each of these groups and the words that are used to characterize them.
And what stands out to you in these? You asked about Black Lives Matter, the alt-right, Antifa, the anti-fascist movement, white nationalists, the white supremacy movement, and the KKK. What stood out to you about the results you got back when you asked people if they mostly agree, mostly disagree, don't have an opinion?
I think what these results really show is that Americans really think there was only one side in Charlottesville. I mean, these groups, particularly white nationalists, the white supremacy movement, the KKK. I mean, these are really fringe groups, marginalized, in this country. 2% of Americans said that they mostly agree with the Ku Klux Klan. 94% said that they disagree. So that, I would say, that was the strongest negative.
And what I thought also was interesting is that those who don't have an opinion that Barb alluded to, or who are unsure, well, that was with the alt-right, which people don't know as much about, I think we would agree, and also the Antifa. And that group on the left, we're talking 71%, I believe, yes, of those of Americans don't have an opinion on them. But what I also thought in all this, which I think I was really surprised, is on Black Lives Matter. Because if you look at your general sense of things, well, Black Lives Matter would also maybe be seen as a fringe group.
Sure. I mean, there's certainly, in the coverage from Ferguson on, there's certainly been across, I think, all the media, a somewhat skeptical view of Black Lives Matter.
But in these numbers, Americans tell 50%. Half the country say they mostly agree with the views expressed by and the beliefs of that group, and only a third say they mostly disagree. So, as Barbara indicated, there's not really equal sides in opposition to each other in Charlottesville. There is one side who's on the fringe, and the other which has much more acceptance, and I think that's why. There is this sense that maybe this was a little more of a defining moment in the Trump presidency than others have been.
Well, but what we had here too is one of those times where, are you going to believe your own eyes, or are you going to believe what the president is saying? And so what was on social media, what was on the news, and has been for days, is the video of the car careening into the counter-protesters. And that was a very, very powerful visual. And I think we asked about that in the poll as well.
You asked if that was if people thought that was domestic terrorism, and using cars to run into people is a tactic used by other terrorist groups, Islamic terrorist groups in Europe, for instance. What were the results of that? What did people think? Did they think that was domestic terrorism?
Again, there's a consensus that people believe that this should be investigated as an act of domestic terrorism.
So the president,
and across racial lines.
So the president has been talking, if not positively, at least on equal terms between the groups, the moral equivalence. But the groups that he's giving, comfort to, if you will, have these tiny approval ratings. The KKK, the white supremacy movement. Does that give those groups some lift? I mean, have you seen any indication that because the president speaks for them, not for them, the president says things about them that they want to hear, we're the same as the anti-fascist movement on the other side? Does that help them?
It doesn't show up in the numbers yet, but I think what you're going to see is, growing sense. There's going to be activities and rallies in other cities, and the lines as a result of to some degree of what the president said, his reaction is going to encourage folks to join those rallies and encourage folks to oppose them. And I think Barb alluded to a very important point here. Donald Trump's been in office just slightly more than 6 months. We've known him for longer than that, clearly. The question that gets kicked around constantly is, does he just have a tin ear, or are these really fundamental to his beliefs? And what we may have seen in this study, and this both polls, is that, well, he seems to have a tin ear because he's really not talking to America right now. He's talking to a fringe, and he seemed to really be forced to condemn the group in one presentation when he did his mulligan, but then he came right back to his original comments. And so maybe it's the tin ear, but it does reflect his beliefs as well.
So let's get back to that question we asked right at the beginning, which is pre-Charlottesville, post-Charlottesville, what's happened to Donald Trump's approval rating among various groups? You've done 2 polls. Tell me about the 2 polls, what they are, when they were done. Let's talk about that.
Yes. So before Charlottesville, we did a national poll to look at the president's approval rating and to get an understanding of what people thought in terms of the issues that he's been trying to address, his campaign promises, and get a sense of whether people who have supported him in the past felt that he was accomplishing what they were looking for. Then Charlottesville. And then we, along with NPR and the PBS NewsHour, did another national poll right afterwards to get a sense, again, of, well, what do people think about the president, and also the events that occurred over the weekend.
And the one number that we can compare, I mean, these are different polls, and they asked a lot of different questions.
We asked different questions.
But you did ask an approval rating question.
Yes,
and the approval rating stayed the same. It was 35 before, and it's been 35 now.
So what does that say? Because I imagine there are some people who would say, how can that be? Charlottesville seems to be this kind of major defining moment, but as we alluded at the beginning, there'll be another defining moment tomorrow. And then there's, I think, people on Trump's side who would say, well, why would it go down? This is Donald Trump. This is who we like. He is speaking his mind. He's doing what we want him to do.
But what we see in these numbers also is that there is, when you drill down a little bit, some warning signs, a cautionary tale for Donald Trump going forward, in that strong Republicans, his core base, well, the approval rating for them fell from 91 to 79 in the original poll, going back to a poll taken a month or so earlier. So there's a sense here, well, his overall approval rating may not have changed, and certainly those who strongly disapprove of Donald Trump outweigh and outnumber those who strongly approve by more than 2 to 1, and so that's also an intensity measure. But we saw all kinds of things in terms of his image, in terms of his issues, which I think also enlighten where Donald Trump is seen right now by Americans.
Yeah, I mean, Lee's making a good point. What we found is interesting is that the poll before Charlottesville was already, telling a cautionary tale about what the president's base is thinking about his presidency and how he's been doing these 6 months. We actually took a look at a number of issues and campaign promises and asked all Americans what they thought and whether they thought he was winning or losing, to use his characterization on each of these topics. And we found that Americans, the majority of Americans, 59%, think that he's winning when it comes to appointing conservative judges to the Supreme Court. 58% think that he has won in terms of requiring stricter screening of non-Americans entering the U.S. But after that, kind of the winning really stops there.
Those are it. Those are the two wins.
He's not able to put together a winning streak.
What are some of the ones where there's most disappointment in his base?
Well, I think what's driving a lot of this is the failure of the president and Congress to come to an agreement on Obamacare and the ACA. Their inability to repeal that is something that, again, we see a lot of consensus on for Americans. Only 23% of Americans think that that was a winning moment for the president, including only 43% of strong Republicans. More Republicans who consider themselves having a strong attachment to the party think that the president lost on that issue.
So I have a question, though, because we talk about the base and Donald Trump's base. Is Donald Trump's base the Republican Party base? Aren't they different? Didn't Donald Trump bring in voters who were not traditional Republicans, maybe not even traditional voters? And so isn't Donald Trump's base, by definition, different than strong Republicans?
Well, that's been the 270 electoral vote question. And what we say is, on this, we ask Republicans, is Donald Trump unifying the Republicans or is he dividing the Republicans? 47% of Republicans think he's unifying Republicans, 43% think he's dividing. So there is a real fault line there that we're seeing. I just want to go back 1 second. What were these other issues that people don't think we're winning? Barb mentioned a few: Obamacare, building a wall, peace in the Middle East, tax reform, picking the best people to be in the government, infrastructure, improving relations with Russia, defeating ISIS, renegotiating trade deals. That's a whole laundry list of things. And while you have all these self-inflicted distractions and controversies, not what went on in Charlottesville, which is obviously much more serious, but this ongoing daily pounding that the country's gotten on all these issues, the agenda seems to be floating, and I think Barb is exactly on target here when she says, and when health care went down, that was a big difference.
So, but the thing that I guess I'm stuck on here a little bit is that this laundry list of things he said he was going to do haven't necessarily come to fruition. In fact, almost none of them have, except for the two that you mentioned. And yet, it doesn't look like his base is crumbling in what you might consider a traditional way of old presidents, of prior presidents. Is it, or am I wrong about that?
Well, let's just step back a moment and talk about what the base is, because I think, Jay, you were making a good point that it's just because a person is Republican doesn't mean that they are part of the president's base. When we look at defining the president's base, we do look at a number of factors. Certainly, partisanship and whether people, consider themselves to be part of the president's party is a really big deal, and how intensely they feel towards the party. And that's why we differentiate between, whether they feel really strongly in terms of their partisanship or whether they maybe consider themselves to be independent, but kind of lean towards the Republican Party. And that kind of intensity does give us a sense and is one measure of the president's base. Another thing we use is we ask people, whether they supported him. last November. And so we define those people as Trump supporters. And you're right, there is a mix of people who, come in and out, who say that, they supported the president, and then that is a group as well. And the thing is, what we're seeing is a change in both of those groups.
Yep.
And that's why it's something that really the president needs to.
What's the change?
Well, the change is that there's just that deterioration in his support in both of those camps. But the thing I think we have to also focus on is when you start out with having been elected without a majority of the country, you start out with 40-something. Well, dropping to 35 may not be as big a drop as other people have had in their presidencies, but when you start so low, you can't go from 70 to 30. There's not enough to give.
Yeah, Nixon went from 70 to 30, but there's no way to go from 70 to 30 when you start at 47. Math doesn't allow that.
That's right. So it is somewhat a game of numbers as well. But I think one of the other things, and this, we've talked about. There's a little bit of a cultural issue with Donald Trump, and in a sense, this is what people misread about him when he was running for president. I mean, when he says, I could go out on Fifth Avenue and shoot someone and it wouldn't affect my core supporters, there was something about that everybody said, what is this going on here? And there is that, that rallying point. But when you fail to repeal and replace Obamacare, that does sober up things in a hurry. So he's not getting it done.
So this is base fatigue? I mean, are they fatigued? Are they getting tired with the daily, nonstop chaos?
I think that's a great characterization. Yeah. I mean, I think, a lot of people are feeling that, and I think that is resonating with his base as well. And it'll be interesting to see if Charlottesville also has more of an impact down the line. This is a poll we're doing, in the midst of the event. But I think one of the things about Charlottesville is that it did unify people, and in terms of how they viewed the president and his reaction on both sides of the aisle. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens.
And it had that unifying effect because the group that Trump is giving some license to is such a fringe group. And so it's not like he's talking to 40% of the country when he says, this was, on many sides, there were people doing bad things.
And it's troubling.
And that's a troubling point. I agree.
And all of this came in a week where it's hard to remember what we were talking about the moment before Charlottesville. Nuclear annihilation would have been a big story in another administration, but somehow the fact that North Korea has threatened, it may have the capability of sending intercontinental ballistic missiles with nuclear weapons to U.S. soil, not Guam, not Hawaii, the mainland. And somehow that story gets overshadowed. You asked about it, though. What has the drama around North Korea, what has that done to the relationship between the American public and their president?
Well, I think you make an interesting point in that the reason why we were talking about Korea is that it appeared, and many Americans thought that the issue was really escalating, and that the president was having a significant impact on the issue. Americans don't really have much of an appetite for military intervention in North Korea.
What are the numbers on that?
Well,
because I think that was true. If you look even back with Iraq and the Middle East, there has been now for a generation a reluctance for Americans to say that they want to commit militarily to things like this.
Actually, more so than you're even suggesting. Barbara did some research and found back in 1967 or 68.
Yeah, 68
when the Pueblo incident occurred.
The USS Pueblo.
Right.
And
they took one of our ships.
Yeah,
and people still didn't want to go in militarily.
And still Americans did not want to go in militarily.
So that's an
And
exclamation
there's
point
been
to what you were saying.
issues. There's been issues of whether the United States will defend South Korea. There has been issues of whether the United States will defend Japan against North Korea. So this isn't actually a new issue, except for, and it's a very big exception, the nuclear program that North Korea is.
So the questions you asked, one of them that just stands out to me as just incredible, and I maybe there are times you've done polling and looked at polls for a long, long time, so maybe you're gonna correct me here and say, no, this happens. 4 out of 10 Americans have no confidence at all in the ability of Donald Trump to lead this country in an international crisis.
Yeah, that's big.
And if you add in not very much, it's 61%. If you walk down the street, 6 in 10 people you stopped are going to go, nah, I have no confidence in that. And we have a country that is may be aiming nuclear-tipped missiles at us that could hit us.
Well, the gentle way of putting it is the president has a long way to go to convince Americans that he can be the commander-in-chief. And that's the kind way of putting it.
You asked another question about North Korea here, and that had to do with what the best way to solve the problem is, which is the same thing. Another way of asking, do you support military intervention or not? Is there any indication that that people believe that the idea of negotiating would be more effective this time than it has been for the last 20 years? There's one question about negotiating directly with the leader of North Korea, which has been a can't cross that line for a lot of Americans on both sides, at least politically in Washington.
Yeah, but I think diplomatic means is what most Americans would like to see take place in a solution of this problem. 40% actually think we should directly negotiate with North Korea, and another third of Americans think that we should convince China to use its influence to stop North Korea's nuclear programs.
Both Democrats and Republicans want to go the diplomatic route, although Republicans are more likely to say, let's have China get in the middle of this and see if they can solve it, whereas Democrats are more likely to side on, let's negotiate directly.
Yeah, but there's very, very little support. We asked other options, such as should the U.S. use airstrikes to knock out North Korea's nuclear facility, and single digits, 9% of Americans thought that should be our first move. 4% thought we should send troops to actually overthrow the government, and 3% went with the U.S. launching a first strike nuclear attack.
Now, we've been sort of intimating, and I think it's going to be a theme that we're going to come back to periodically on these podcasts, just how unique is the situation right now? How much are we breaking new ground? And I think as pollsters, we're feeling there's some new ground being broken here. I'm very curious, as to someone who has not only been an observer of politics, but a professional journalist for decades, as you would approach this, would you be looking at this with a new set of lenses, or are you saying, let me see how I can look at Donald Trump and how he's doing and things like Charlottesville and Korea, and see if I can use old models to help explain?
Yeah, I think reporters have struggled with that. I think everybody's struggled with trying to fit this guy into the box that every prior president, to one degree or another, has been in. And whether that was during the campaign, when we all tried to fit him into a box, will the Republican Party accept him? Well, will the Republican Party implode? Well, no, he'll just take over the Republican Party, as it turned out. Not something that anybody really thought would happen. I think this guy has worked outside of all the boxes that we have all believed that politics tends to get played in, and that makes polls like this both really instructive, but at the same time, do you just throw up your hands again and go, well, we've looked at polls before that have said all kinds of things, and nothing really changes. Yeah. I am struck by 61% of people not having any faith in him in an international crisis. I think that we vote our pocketbooks, and I mean, you have data to suggest it. So we vote our pocketbooks when we vote a president. But when it comes to what we feel about a president in the midst of a term and how much confidence we have and what we think of that president, It really has more to do with moral authority and the kind of international things and things like that, as opposed to the economy at any given point in time.
People are wondering whether he's lost some of his moral authority.
And at 61%, having no faith in international crisis and the moral authority question, I think it's new ground. I do think it's new ground.
And I think that's why everybody was talking time and time again, is he going to pivot? Is he going to pivot? Is he going to return to something we recognize? And the answer, I think if anything we learned in the last week or so, is that pivot thing just isn't part of his arsenal.
So Maggie Haberman of the New York Times, who covered him as a tabloid reporter in New York for years, I worked with her at City Hall Bureau in New York. Maggie has been absolutely firm from the beginning. He'll never change. He is who he is. Maggie Haberman's right on this one. He is who he is, and he's not changing. And I think that this poll and what Charlottesville has shown, don't expect anything to ever change. He is who he is at his age. You can't teach an old dog new tricks. Now, I know I just called the president a dog, and I didn't mean that. I like dogs.
I was thinking of your dog in that instance.
Yeah, and my dog is an old dog, and we did teach him a new trick, but, that's another story.
That will do it for this edition of Poll Hub. We would love to hear from you, so please send your questions to pollhub@marist.edu, and check us out on social media at Marist Poll on Twitter, Marist Poll on Facebook, Snapchat, and Instagram. And please don't forget to subscribe.